So my name is Sandile Mbatha. I am previously from eThekwini municipality, so I've just recently joined COGTA, and my job will be that of a National Chief Data Officer. It's an uncharted territory because there's no sort of benchmark on how that looks like, and so we're creating things as we go. But I do like the fact that I'm speaking after Alfred and he set the context in terms of how government thinks about data, thinks about digital tools. And my primary interest is really on what the juice that comes out of the digital tools themselves rather than the digital tools. Of course, data will not necessarily exist in its current form unless it's coming out of those sort of digital tools. So I do, of course, appreciate the digital tools themselves, but of course the data is also created outside of the digital tools. But before I start, I always start with this question, and those who might have seen this question, please forgive me. I'm not sure whether you guys will be able to answer. So I always ask the question of how does your chocolate taste? And I begin by asking, where does your favorite chocolate comes from? And often I get an answer that it comes from Switzerland. Some say Belgium, some say France, some say different kind of places. Then I ask a question around, and I'm not going to ask because it's a webinar format and I have 10 minutes and I want to be respectful of time. And this format doesn't allow that conversation to take its natural course as I would often want it to do. Then I ask a question of where cocoa is produced. Then people start saying, well, as an example, about 75% of world cocoa come from West Africa. And the question after that is how much of chocolate comes from those countries? Only 1% or less than 1% of the world cocoa of world chocolate comes from West Africa. And then I ask a question around how much do cocoa farmers earn in these countries, and they earn less than $1 a day. They're probably one of the most poorest people, poorest farmers in West Africa. And the data goes on. And then again, I ask a question right at the end on how does your chocolate taste? Does it still taste sweet, or does it now taste bittersweet now that you know the information about the cocoa industry? And I think it's an important, for me, I used this slide initially when I was presenting in one of the universities in Switzerland, to try and be provocative, because the Swiss are very proud of their chocolate, and sometimes naively so, without understanding the value chain of where the cocoa production comes from and the entire cocoa production and the detrimental effects it has. So then I come back and ask a question: how do we make decisions in spaces that are way more important than choosing a chocolate without looking at data? Because if we now know very well that we cannot even pick a chocolate or even pick a steak or food to eat or type of food to eat without understanding the data, because that informs us on how impactful the decisions we make, right? And I could argue that every decision you make in life is based on data. And very often people think data is what's on CSVs, on databases, on Excel sheets, but data is the information that you have, and some of it may be captured in your head. So there's quite a lot of things that I think we need to understand the importance of data, and that's the argument I'm going to make today in the next 9.5 minutes. I'm assuming that I've just used half a minute before, just disrupting the timekeeper, obviously, in this instance. One of the arguments I'm going to make is that data is critical infrastructure, it's an asset, and no decision should be made without data, particularly in the public sector. Because there's taxpayers' money. We use resources that are from the public, but also we are responsible as a public service, as a public sector, for supporting the quality of life of our citizens. So the context of data in the public sector, and I often don't want to pathologize the public sector, and I think that's the job of all the news media and television station, to say how horrible the state is. So I'm not going to go there. But the current data scenario is such that there's poor data governance. And I think Alfred has touched on that a little bit. There's static data sets that are littered everywhere. And particularly this is very common in local government. And I've seen some of the colleagues from from the city of Cape Town, and they've been navigating this, and the city's colleagues from Tequini and other metros are navigating these kind of spaces. And there's massive data silos that are not only just in local government, but in the whole of government. And I think Alfred was touching on it as well, that if Home Affairs have these kind of data sets and education does not have the same data set that Home Affairs, as an example, is looking at. And I'll make that example in terms of what we're going to do going forward. And I'm putting myself as responsible for doing that. So data collection gaps, some of the data sets we're not collecting at all. There's data-centered egos, and I think that's a bit more complicated. There's people in government who believe that in order for you to have access to data, you must go through them. And when you don't, because again, you've followed what Alfred was talking about, of saying there's data sharing principles and data is easily available within the public sector, across government, across the spheres of government. So sometimes those people feel that they don't have the same importance as they've held before. So that becomes extremely problematic. There's a lack of data sharing principles, and we're getting there to try and resolve that. There's disintegrated data storage systems. Not all our data is on cloud. Not all our data is on SQL servers or servers. Some of our data is really floating around on Excel sheets, on CSV. Some even on just hard paper. But what is the impact of that? And I think that's the most important thing. And I didn't want to make the slide move, and so I'm going to confuse you by just blowing this thing all on your slide, because I wanted to move one by one, but we'll let it be at this point. So as a result of these challenges with poor core governance, because if our citizens do not have a view of what's going on in the public sector, they will make a frankly boring statement that often comes from your News 24, your ETV, and so forth, of government is inefficient, there's incompetence, which I find frankly boring, because it's not coming up with a pointed argument on what is the problem with the state and what is the problem with the public service itself. It just really picks on an easy narrative that the government is incompetent, and of course that incompetence is always linked to certain type of people and so forth. But how do we expect our citizens to make informed decisions on how to criticize, on how to come up with constructive criticism without having the view of what's going on within the state? And that's the problem. There's poor strategic decision making. We haven't made the right decisions over the past 30 years, for example. And of course, we could make examples about Ground Zero in the Western Cape and say, well, was it an issue of not having access to data, or not using the data to strategically plan and look ahead? It's easy to blame climate change, of course, because it's somewhere up in a cloud. And there's many other reasons. And we talk about, Alfred is facing load shedding. If we anticipated that our population will grow and more people will have access to electricity, will need access to electricity, we would anticipate that will happen, then we'll have made better strategic decisions, right? So there's lack of evidence-based policymaking. There's poor resource allocation. So we're throwing money around and we're not really knowing what problem we're trying to solve. There's process inefficiencies. And I don't have to tell any of you how annoying it is to go to Home Affairs or to go to any unit or government office and you are asked about your ID number again and again from one municipality as an example, or from one government as an example. We need your ID number for this, we need this, which you've already provided to one government entity. So that creates the process inefficiencies. Poor service delivery, we don't have to talk about that because we're all South Africans, we're fully aware. Even the Kenyan colleague, Karibu Sana, you understand that it's the same, I guess, in that context as well. And then, of course, the silos that exist within the public sector. But then that's important. We've set the context, so we're admitting that these are the challenges and we need to resolve these challenges, and data could assist us to resolve these challenges, but there's a lot of things that need to change. And one of those things is a mindset shift. What do we need to shift? We need to shift and position data as critical infrastructure and an asset, and that's one thing that I'm married to. It's an idea that I'm married to very closely. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to see the value in data. We've got to invest in data and digital tools. There's a statistic that on average, when we invest $1 on data and digital tools, the return on investment is at least about $32 on economic benefits and so forth, right? We need to shift, there needs to be a shift in data culture within the public service, that we build institutional data literacy and trust in the data that we create. There's a lot of data illiteracy that exists within government and within the public as a whole. We also need to understand that data as a public good is a collective responsibility. And very often when people talk about open data, they assume that opening data is a prerogative of the state or the public sector, right? And I think I argue otherwise to say there's public sector like corporates, NGOs, civil society that are collecting data on our public on our citizens, and yet when this data is required to assist the citizens, that data is then not made available. Instead, it's monetized. And I think we have to be very robust in our discussion with the corporate sector. And I know, and I'm not going to mention any of the organizations in this platform that are starting to monetize that data. For instance, the mobility data. And I know that one of the big four telecoms companies, they're going to start monetizing some of the data of your connectivity on your phone to say, well, we can monitor your movement and therefore we can sell this data back to the state. But what other data sets can then be made available for public good? And we need to push for that. That is not only the prerogative of the state, but it's also a prerogative of everyone who benefits out of citizens having access to data and making the better decisions. We need to build a robust data ecosystem where the academia, public sector, civil society organization, the CBOs, the citizens themselves, because there's a lot of citizen science, a lot of citizens data that's collected. How do we build this robust data ecosystem where we're all contributing to quality data for public good? We need to build trust in the data and digital tools, and I think that has been touched on by Alfred, so I'm not going to go back there. What happens if we do this shift, right? I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I was assuming that I'm doing very well for time, but I'm about to wrap up, Chair. What data then enables is life cycle planning. And I think Alfred was touching on that to say there is no reason in this country that we don't anticipate and we don't know how many kids will be going into first grade or grade R in a particular year, because we have what is called vital registry, the three registries, the birth, marriage and death. We have to be able to anticipate using that data. Again, piggybacking on Alfred's example, without that data being synthesized and value extracted from the data, that data, we're not able to plan. Right? Once we've planned and people have gone to school, how do we anticipate what kind of sectors then need to be enhanced and supported in order for the people that are going through an education system then to be absorbed in that sector? In fact, I've jumped a sector because I have not even spoken about SASA grants support. I haven't spoken about the NSFAS and universities and so forth. So we want to be able to support life cycle planning. We want to increase operational efficiencies. We want to ensure that there's efficient resource allocation through data. It will also enable improved decision making, data-driven strategic decision-making, so we can anticipate in the future. But it will also allow the public sector to understand the needs of people that we serve. And because at the moment, we don't really understand, right? And what is their context and what exactly do they need? And there's various examples that I could go into, but in 10 minutes, it's going to be very difficult for me to go to some of these examples. What are the needs of our stakeholders? How do we meet these needs in an innovative and efficient manner? How do we facilitate co-governance? And I've touched on that before. But data will also empower stakeholder citizens to meaningfully participate in a governance process, because they will understand what's going on in the public sector. It will also foster inclusive and equitable access to public services, as we understand where our services go and where they don't go, where they don't reach, what kind of depth. Because at the moment, for the past 30 years, we've been focusing mostly on width, access to public services instead of depth in terms of quality of those services. And it's a conversation we can have for much longer time. But I want to leave maybe perhaps with a positive contribution of saying there is something that's happening. I think Alfred has spoken from the policy and legislative point of view, that there is a lot of things happening. What you are seeing in front of you is what we presented as a POC, a proof of concept, we started in July 2023. And in November, if I'm not mistaken, October of 2023, we got a cabinet decision to allow us to build the national strategic hub. And that's the reason why I've moved to national, to integrate country-level data, extract value from data, in support of the DDM, in support of the implementation of the NDP and various other programs. It's going to be a massive, massive task. But what you are seeing here is just an example of the art of what's possible, of what could happen in the future. And I'm one of those people who want to often put their head on the block, that if things fail, and if this fail, and what I'm promising here fails, it's purely on me. And there's a team that I'm trying to put together, but I'm also understanding and not naive, of course, of the context that I'm going into of national government, that things aren't going to move as fast. There's going to be obstacles because of what I've mentioned earlier in terms of some of the challenges that exist within the public service in terms of data egos, the data silos that exist, and of course the interest that comes from consultants and so forth, to want to capture the space. But again, I also want to make this a call to action and collaboration from the big metros to say, come in, let's work together on some of these things. Let's make some of the data available that you guys don't have access to. We'll provide that access. But let's play around with AI, because there's a whole lot of AI tools that exist as well. So one of the issues is not just these dashboards. We'll create something we'll call a GovSearch tool that will allow you to be able to search government data, using some of the AI prompts that we'll be able to build without, of course, again, Emma is cringing because she's thinking, oh, you're going to train the bigger model of AI using our government data, because that will be very dangerous, and we're not going to do that. So we're going to do a whole lot of things to make sure that we safeguard the data of the public, and extract value from that. Colleagues, I think I've exhausted my time, and also I didn't want to exhaust you as well. So I will stop there, and first to thank some of our colleagues that have presented earlier, and also to thank the organizers, the chair, and the people that are on this call. And hopefully we'll find space and opportunity to collaborate going forward, to make data, to elevate data as a public infrastructure and an asset, and see how we can extract value from that. Ngiyabonga kakhulu, Emma. Thank you so much.